Empire gone, no warning, millions vanished. One signature, everything changed. In December 1991, the world's largest country vanished within days. No war, no invasion, just collapse from the inside out. The USSR once covered 1/6 of the entire planet's land. It built nuclear weapons, launched satellites, and ruled half the world. Then it disappeared overnight, leaving 15 shattered nations behind it. You've heard the myth, communism simply failed under its own weight. The real story involves betrayal, secret speeches, and a hidden famine. Today you'll learn exactly how a superpower destroyed itself from within. We'll trace 7 leaders, 4 wars, and 1 fatal reform. You'll see Lenin's gamble, Stalin's terror, and Gorbachev's fatal mistake. By the end, you'll understand why openness killed the Soviet Union. This isn't textbook history, this is the story behind the headlines. Every fact here comes from declassified archives and leading historians. Stay until the end for the single moment everything fell apart. This is the rise and fall of the USSR, uncensored. You'll discover why Stalin killed more Soviets than any invading army. You'll learn how one famine killed millions and stayed hidden for decades. You'll see how one leader's pride nearly triggered nuclear war. You'll uncover why Afghanistan became the Soviet Union's own Vietnam. You'll understand why reform, not revolution, finally broke the empire. We'll show you the coup that failed and the country that didn't survive it. You'll meet the man who tried to save communism and ended it instead. Every event connects to the next, building toward one final collapse. Grab a coffee. This journey covers 70 years in 30 minutes. Let's go back to 1917, where this entire story begins. By 1917, the Russian Empire was starving, exhausted, and out of patience. World War I had killed nearly 2 million Russian soldiers already. Bread lines in Petrograd stretched 4 blocks in freezing winter cold. Workers and soldiers finally turned against Tsar Nicholas II himself. In February 1917, the 300-year Romanov dynasty simply collapsed. A fragile provisional government took power but refused to end the war. That single decision would cost them everything within 8 months. Meanwhile, an exiled revolutionary was plotting his return from Switzerland. Vladimir Lenin traveled home in a sealed German train car. Germany hoped he'd destabilize Russia and pull it out of the war. Lenin arrived in April 1917 with a radical, uncompromising plan. His April theses demanded peace, land, and all power to workers. Most fellow socialists thought his ideas were dangerously extreme at first, but hunger and war fatigue made his message spread like wildfire. The Bolsheviks were a minority party with an outsized ambition. On October 25, 1917, they stormed the Winter Palace at night. The takeover was shockingly quick, almost bloodless, and brutally effective. Lenin declared a new government before dawn had even broken. He immediately pulled Russia out of World War I entirely. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk cost Russia 1/3 of its population. Losing that land triggered fury from nationalists across the empire. A brutal civil war erupted between Reds and White forces. Over 5 years, the war killed roughly 7 to 12 million people. Lenin created the Cheka, a secret police built purely for terror. The Red Terror executed tens of thousands without trial or mercy. War communism seized grain from peasants to feed the cities. Forced requisitioning triggered famine that killed millions more people. By 1921, the economy had shrunk to a fraction of its size. Facing collapse, Lenin reversed course with a new economic policy. NEP allowed small private trade to survive alongside state control. It was a pragmatic retreat, not an ideological victory for capitalism. The economy slowly recovered, but political freedom never returned. In 1922, Lenin formally created the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. 4 republics merged under one flag, one party, one leader. Lenin suffered a stroke that same year and slowly declined. Before dying, he wrote a secret warning about his likely successor. His testament urged the party to remove Joseph Stalin from power. The party buried that warning and buried Lenin as a saint instead. Lenin died in January 1924, sparking a brutal succession struggle. His body was embalmed and displayed, turning him into a myth. Behind the scenes, Stalin was already outmaneuvering every single rival. He used bureaucratic control, not charisma, to seize real power. Trotsky, the revolution's brilliant strategist, was slowly isolated and exiled. By 1929, Trotsky was expelled from the Soviet Union entirely. He was later assassinated with an ice axe in Mexico City. Stalin had learned Lenin's lesson better than anyone else alive. Control the party machinery, and you control the entire country. The revolution that promised freedom now belonged to one ruthless man. Lenin built the state. Stalin was about to weaponize it. What came next would be far darker than anyone imagined. By 1928, Stalin held total and challenged control of the Soviet Union. He launched the first 5-year plan to industrialize almost overnight. Factories rose across the country at a brutal breakneck pace. Steel production soared, but human cost was deliberately ignored entirely. Stalin forced millions of peasants onto collective farms by decree. Those who resisted collectivization were labeled kulaks and enemies of the state. Grain quotas were set so high that villages had nothing left. In Ukraine, this triggered a catastrophic famine called the Holodomor. Historians estimate between 3 and 5 million Ukrainians starved to death. Soviet authorities denied the famine and blocked international aid entirely. Stalin used starvation as a weapon against political resistance itself. By the mid-1930s, paranoia inside the Kremlin reached a fever pitch. Stalin launched the Great Purge to eliminate any perceived threat. Show trials forced loyal officials to confess to invented crimes. Nearly every original Bolshevik leader was executed or sent to labor camps. Nikolai Yezhov, the purge's chief executioner, was later purged himself. The Gulag system expanded into a vast network of forced labor camps. Historians estimate roughly 18 million people passed through gulags total. Conditions were so brutal that hundreds of thousands never returned home. The military wasn't spared either, losing most of its top officers. Stalin executed 3 of 5 marshals right before World War II. That decision would nearly cost the Soviet Union the entire war. In 1939, Stalin signed a shocking pact with Nazi Germany. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact secretly divided Eastern Europe between 2 dictators. Stalin believed the deal bought him time to rebuild his military. In June 1941, Hitler betrayed him and invaded without warning. Operation Barbarossa was the largest military invasion in human history. Soviet forces initially collapsed, losing millions of soldiers within months. Stalin refused to believe intelligence warnings until tanks crossed the border. Slowly, brutally, the Red Army began pushing German forces back. The Battle of Stalingrad became the war's bloodiest turning point. Nearly 2 million people died in that single, freezing battle. By 1945, Soviet troops had captured Berlin and ended the war. The Soviet Union lost between 20 and 27 million citizens total. No nation paid a higher human price in World War II. Victory gave Stalin enormous prestige and total control over Eastern Europe. He installed loyal communist governments across nearly every liberated country. This division of Europe became the foundation of the Cold War. At home, Stalin launched new purges targeting doctors and intellectuals. Paranoia never left him, even after total military triumph. In March 1953, Stalin suffered a stroke and died days later. Millions of Soviets genuinely wept, having known no other leader. Behind closed doors, his own inner circle felt relief, not grief. Stalin had transformed a peasant nation into a nuclear superpower. He also killed more of his own citizens than any foreign enemy. Historians still debate his total death toll, likely 20 million or more. A power vacuum immediately opened among his terrified former lieutenants. One man would soon dare to say what nobody else would. His name was Nikita Khrushchev, and he was about to shock everyone. Khrushchev outmaneuvered his rivals and secured power by 1955. In February 1956, he delivered history's most explosive political speech. The secret speech denounced Stalin's crimes to a stunned party congress. Delegates reportedly fainted as Khrushchev detailed decades of hidden atrocities. Word leaked out fast, shaking communist parties across the entire world. This began a fragile period historians now call de-Stalinization. Millions of Gulag prisoners were quietly released and partially rehabilitated. Yet the speech also cracked the myth holding the system together. In Hungary later that year, citizens rose up against Soviet control. Khrushchev crushed the uprising with tanks, killing thousands of Hungarians. The message was clear. Reform had strict non-negotiable limits. On the world stage, Khrushchev pursued a very different kind of victory. In October 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first satellite ever. It triggered genuine panic in the United States almost overnight. The space race had officially begun, fueled by Cold War pride. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit Earth. Soviet science briefly looked years ahead of the American program, but behind the propaganda, domestic problems were quietly piling up. Khrushchev launched the Virgin Lands campaign to boost grain production. Early success gave way to soil erosion and disappointing harvests. His unpredictable, impulsive style unsettled even his closest allies. In 1961, tensions over Berlin nearly triggered direct military conflict. East Germany built a wall overnight, dividing the city in two. Thousands of families were separated within a single terrifying weekend. In 1962, Khrushchev made his boldest and most dangerous move. He secretly placed nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba. American spy planes discovered the missile sites within weeks. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the edge of nuclear war. For 13 days, humanity stood closer to annihilation than ever before. Kennedy and Khrushchev negotiated secretly to avoid catastrophic escalation. The Soviets agreed to remove missiles in exchange for concessions. The world exhaled, but Khrushchev's authority never fully recovered. His colleagues viewed the crisis as a humiliating, reckless gamble. His economic reforms had also failed to deliver lasting results. Grain shortages forced the Soviet Union to import wheat from America. That single fact deeply embarrassed a supposedly self-sufficient superpower. In October 1964, party officials quietly organized his removal from power. Khrushchev was voted out while vacationing far from Moscow. He was the first Soviet leader removed without violence or execution. He lived out his remaining years writing memoirs in quiet obscurity. His downfall proved something new about Soviet leadership itself. Even total power could now be lost through political maneuvering. Khrushchev's era exposed cracks the propaganda machine couldn't fully hide. He had denounced Stalin but never dismantled Stalin's core system. Reform without structural change created instability instead of real progress. His successor would choose stability over risk at every turn. That choice would define the next 2 decades entirely. Leonid Brezhnev was about to trade dynamism for pure control. The result would later be called the Era of Stagnation and Stagnation. Historians argue quietly doomed the entire Soviet project. Brezhnev became leader in 1964, promising stability after Khrushchev's chaos. He favored caution, consensus, and rewarding loyal party officials generously for years. This brought genuine calm after decades of upheaval. The Soviet military expanded to rival American strength by the 1970s. Nuclear parity gave Brezhnev real leverage on the world stage. In 1968, Czechoslovakia attempted sweeping political and economic reforms. The Prague Spring promised what leaders called socialism with a human face. Brezhnev viewed this experiment as an existential threat to Soviet control. Soviet tanks rolled into Prague in August 1968 to crush it. The Brezhnev doctrine now justified invading any wavering communist ally. This sent a chilling message across the entire Eastern Bloc. Meanwhile, the Soviets poured resources into supporting North Vietnam's war. Soviet weapons and advisors helped Vietnam fight the United States directly. It became a proxy battlefield in the wider global Cold War. The Soviets gained influence but drained resources for over a decade. By the 1970s, Brezhnev pursued détente, easing tensions with the West. The Helsinki Accords of 1975 formally recognized post-war European borders. In exchange, the Soviet Union pledged to respect basic human rights. Dissidents like Andrei Sakharov used those promises against the regime itself. Sakharov's activism made him a global symbol of Soviet repression. Behind the diplomacy, the domestic economy was quietly falling apart. Central planning couldn't match consumer demand for basic everyday goods. Shortages became routine. Soap, meat, even toilet paper vanished regularly. Long queues became a defining image of ordinary Soviet daily life. Corruption spread through every level of the bloated party bureaucracy. Officials openly hoarded privileges while ordinary citizens waited in lines. Alcoholism rose sharply, quietly cutting into national productivity and health. Oil exports briefly masked deeper economic problems during the 1970s when oil prices crashed later. That hidden fragility became impossible to hide. Brezhnev's health declined steadily, yet he clung tightly to power. Aging leaders surrounded him, creating what historians call a gerontocracy. Decision-making slowed to a crawl inside an increasingly rigid system. In 1979, Brezhnev made a decision that would haunt the U.S. He ordered Soviet troops to invade neighboring Afghanistan directly. The goal was propping up a fragile communist government there. Instead, it triggered a brutal decade-long guerrilla war of attrition. The United States quietly armed Afghan fighters resisting Soviet occupation. Soviet soldiers found themselves trapped in mountains they couldn't control. The war drained money, morale, and international goodwill simultaneously. Soviet media largely hid the war's true cost from citizens back home. Soldiers returned traumatized, met with silence instead of national recognition. Brezhnev died in November 1982, still clinging to power. His successor Yuri Andropov tried reforms but died just 15 months later. Konstantin Chernenko followed, already frail, and died within another year. 3 leaders died in rapid succession, embarrassing the entire Soviet system. The world watched a superpower struggle to find stable leadership. The party desperately needed someone younger, sharper, and different. In March 1985, they finally chose a 54-year-old reformer. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev, and nothing would be the same. What he unleashed next would end the Soviet Union entirely. The Cold War was never just a standoff between two capitals. It was fought through dozens of smaller, deadlier proxy conflicts. Vietnam became one of the era's most devastating battlegrounds. The Soviets funneled weapons, funding, and training to North Vietnamese forces. Chinese and Soviet rivalry complicated their shared support for Hanoi. American involvement escalated dramatically throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. The war killed roughly 2 to 3 million Vietnamese people total. Nearly 60,000 American soldiers also lost their lives there. For Moscow, Vietnam offered a low-cost way to bleed American resources. It also proved communism could survive direct confrontation with America. That perceived victory encouraged riskier Soviet moves in later decades. Simultaneously, the Soviets backed revolutionary movements across Africa and Latin America. Angola, Ethiopia, and Mozambique all became Cold War battlegrounds. Cuban troops, funded by Moscow, fought wars far from home. Each conflict drained Soviet resources while barely making headlines back home. By the late Tealing's détente with the West was fraying badly. Human rights criticism from the West embarrassed Soviet leadership internationally. Then came the decision that historians call a fatal turning point. In December 1979, Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan to prop up its government. Leaders expected a quick, limited operation, lasting only months. Instead, they triggered a brutal insurgency that lasted nearly 10 years. Afghan Mujahideen fighters used the country's mountains as natural fortresses. The United States, through Operation Cyclone, funneled weapons to the resistance. Stinger missiles later given to fighters neutralized Soviet air superiority. Soviet helicopters, once dominant, became vulnerable and increasingly ineffective. Roughly 15,000 Soviet soldiers died in the grinding conflict. Estimates suggest over 1 million Afghan civilians died during the war. 5 million more were displaced as refugees across the region. Soviet soldiers, many just teenagers, returned home physically and psychologically broken. The government largely censored coverage, hiding the war's true toll. Soldiers called it their generation's Vietnam, a comparison leadership hated. The war drained the Soviet treasury at the worst possible moment. Oil prices were falling, and the economy was already struggling badly. Global condemnation, including a US-led Olympic boycott, isolated the Soviets further. Domestically, families quietly grew furious over sons who never returned. The war exposed serious weaknesses in Soviet military planning and logistics. It also revealed deep cracks in the illusion of unstoppable power. Gorbachev, upon taking power, inherited this costly, unpopular war directly. He privately called Afghanistan a bleeding wound within his own government. In 1989, Soviet troops finally withdrew after nearly a decade of fighting. The withdrawal was widely seen as a humiliating strategic defeat. It emboldened independence movements watching Moscow's weakness unfold in real time. Afghanistan foreshadowed the empire's fragility years before its final collapse. Historians now call it one direct cause of Soviet economic exhaustion. Military spending had reached unsustainable levels across multiple simultaneous conflicts. The empire had overextended itself chasing global influence for decades. Every proxy war abroad quietly weakened the foundation back home. The Cold War's hidden fires were slowly burning the USSR down. Gorbachev would soon try something radical to save what remained. His solution would accidentally accelerate the very collapse he feared. Gorbachev inherited a nation stagnant, indebted, and quietly falling apart. He recognized the Soviet system needed radical, immediate transformation. In 1985, he introduced perestroika, meaning economic and political restructuring. The plan allowed limited private enterprise within a still socialist framework. He also introduced glasnost, a policy of unprecedented public openness. For the first time, media could criticize government failures openly. Citizens suddenly discussed topics long forbidden under decades of censorship. Historical crimes, including Stalin's purges, were finally acknowledged publicly. This openness electrified intellectuals but terrified hardline party officials. In April 1986, disaster struck at the Chernobyl nuclear plant. A reactor exploded, releasing radioactive material across Europe instantly. Soviet authorities initially tried to cover up the catastrophe entirely. Delayed evacuation exposed thousands of residents to dangerous radiation levels. Gorbachev later called Chernobyl a turning point, exposing the system's rot. The disaster proved glasnost wasn't optional anymore. It was necessary. Public trust in Soviet institutions eroded rapidly after the cover-up. Meanwhile, Gorbachev pursued dramatic diplomacy with the United States directly. He met Reagan multiple times, building surprising personal rapport. In 1987, they signed the INF Treaty, eliminating an entire missile class. Gorbachev also announced troop reductions across Eastern Europe unilaterally. He signaled Moscow would no longer enforce control through military force. This reversed the Brezhnev doctrine that had crushed Prague in 1968. Eastern European nations quickly sensed an unprecedented opportunity for change. In 1989, Poland held partially free elections, stunning communist leadership. Solidarity, the independent trade union, won a decisive political victory. Hungary soon opened its border, letting East Germans flee westward. Momentum for change spread rapidly across the entire Eastern Bloc. In November 1989, crowds gathered at the Berlin Wall unexpectedly. A confused announcement led guards to open the checkpoints that night. Thousands of Germans tore down the wall with hammers in hands. The moment became the era's most powerful symbol of collapse. Communist governments fell across Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria within months. Romania's revolution turned violent, ending with its dictator's swift execution. Gorbachev watched the Eastern Bloc dissolve without sending in troops. His refusal to intervene shocked hardliners inside the Kremlin itself. Domestically, economic reforms were producing chaos instead of promised prosperity. Store shelves grew emptier even as political freedoms kept expanding. Inflation soared while wages stayed frozen for millions of workers. Nationalist movements within Soviet republics began demanding real independence. The Baltic states, Georgia, and Ukraine pushed hardest for autonomy. Gorbachev tried balancing reform with unity, satisfying almost nobody involved. Hardliners accused him of destroying communism from within the party. Reformers accused him of moving far too slowly and cautiously. By 1990, Gorbachev held unprecedented power but shrinking real control. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for ending Cold War tensions. Yet at home, His approval ratings were falling dramatically fast. The empire he tried to save was unraveling in every direction. Perestroika had opened doors that could no longer be closed again. Glasnost had given people a voice, and they wanted independence. One final, desperate gamble was about to seal the Union's fate. By mid-1991, the Soviet Union was fracturing at every seam. Gorbachev proposed a new treaty granting republics far greater autonomy. Hardliners in the party viewed this treaty as pure betrayal. On August 19, 1991, conspirators launched a sudden coup attempt. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest at his Crimean dacha. State television announced an emergency committee had seized total control. Tanks rolled into Moscow, but the plotters lacked a real plan. Boris Yeltsin, Russia's president, climbed atop a tank in defiance. His speech rallying resistance was broadcast around the world instantly. Thousands of Muscovites built barricades to block the advancing tanks. Soldiers hesitated, refusing orders to fire on their own citizens. Within 3 days, the poorly organized coup completely collapsed. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but his authority was permanently damaged. Yeltsin, not Gorbachev, now held the real power in Russia. The coup had accidentally accelerated the very collapse it tried to stop. One by one, Soviet republics declared formal independence within weeks. Ukraine's independence referendum passed with overwhelming public support in December. On December 8, 1991, 3 republic leaders met secretly in Belarus. Russia, Ukraine and Belarus agreed the Soviet Union simply ceased existing. They formed a loose commonwealth of independent states instead. Gorbachev learned about his own country's dissolution through a phone call. He had no real power left to stop the decision. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev formally resigned as Soviet president. The Soviet flag over the Kremlin was lowered for the final time. The Russian tricolor rose in its place minutes later that evening. The following day, the Soviet Union officially ceased to legally exist. 15 new independent nations emerged from one collapsed federation. It ended not with revolution, but with quiet, bureaucratic paperwork. 74 years of Soviet history concluded almost without violence. Millions of Russians woke up citizens of an entirely new country. Savings, pensions, and lifelong certainties vanished within a single winter. Economic collapse followed swiftly, wiping out savings through hyperinflation. Life expectancy in Russia dropped sharply during the chaotic 1990s. Former Soviet elites often became wealthy through rapid, chaotic privatization. Ordinary citizens frequently lost everything they had spent decades building. Historians still debate exactly why the collapse happened so suddenly. Economic stagnation, military overreach, and reform combined to trigger it. Nationalism, suppressed for decades, resurfaced with overwhelming, unstoppable force. Glasnost gave people truth, and truth undermined the system's foundation. Perestroika promised prosperity, but delivered shortages and public frustration instead. The Afghan war drained resources at precisely the worst moment. Chernobyl shattered public trust the government could never fully rebuild. No single cause explains the collapse. Every factor compounded together. Gorbachev remains a divisive figure across the former Soviet world. Many credit him with ending the Cold War peacefully overall. Others blame him for the loss of superpower status entirely. The Soviet collapse remains one of history's largest peaceful dissolutions. No nuclear war, no full-scale civil war, just sudden dissolution. Its legacy still shapes Russian politics and identity today. The empire that once ruled half the world simply disappeared, and most of the world barely saw it coming at all. So what actually killed the Soviet Union in the end? It wasn't one war, one leader, or one single decision. It was 70 years of contradictions finally colliding all at once. Lenin's revolution promised equality but delivered centralized absolute control instead. Stalin built an industrial superpower on a foundation of terror. Khrushchev exposed the truth but couldn't fix what it revealed. Brezhnev chose stability, and stability quietly became stagnation over decades. Afghanistan proved even superpowers can be drained by endless war. Gorbachev tried honesty, and honesty proved impossible to fully control. Openness and reform, meant to save the system, ultimately dissolved it. The Soviet story is a warning about power without accountability. It's also a warning about reform arriving decades too late. Empires rarely fall from outside attack, they fracture from within. Economic truth, eventually, always outweighs political propaganda and denial. Millions paid the price for decisions made by very few men. Their stories rarely make it into simplified textbook summaries anywhere. Understanding this collapse helps explain today's geopolitics far more clearly. Russia, Ukraine, and neighboring nations still live with these consequences. The Cold War's echoes shape headlines you're reading right now. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes in dangerous ways. If this deep dive taught you something new, that's the entire point. Real history is messier, stranger, and more human than any myth. Every leader here believed they were saving their country somehow. Most of them accelerated the very collapse they feared most. That irony sits at the center of this entire story. If you want more deep dives like this, subscribe right now. Drop a comment. Which leader do you think mattered most? Share this video with someone who loves real, researched history. Hit the bell so you never miss the next deep dive. Thank you for watching until the very last word.